I'm Gary Matheny, and I have some new information here about the Red Sea crossing, information that no one else has. If they have it, they got it from me. I've read all the different routes. I know what their reasons are. I have brand new information. Even if you hold to the other routes, you're probably going to want to hear this. There is a Egyptian legend that talks about the Red Sea crossing of Israel, not the el-Arish shrine that only had one place name, and the Egyptians win there, but one that has the Egyptians losing, which is something that's very rare. There is a Bible verse that has the nation of Israel leaving from the west side of the Nile. Josephus has them leaving from there, but there's a place in the Bible which pointedly says that. Now, how could those two big major parts, major pieces to the puzzle be missing? Because they happen in a location that was totally unexpected. Have you ever wondered why the Great Sphinx and the Great Pyramid are not mentioned in the Bible? They're the greatest landmarks of Egypt. The Great Pyramid is the only one of the 7 wonders of the world that has survived unto this day, and yet the majority of Bible scholars are saying it's not in the Bible, and the Sphinx is not in the Bible. They're both in the Bible. They're clearly in the Bible. There's some that use that passage in Isaiah, and it says that there shall be an altar to the Lord, and they say it's in the midst of the land of Egypt, and they say that's possibly the Great Pyramid. Well, it's not an altar. I believe that's a stretch. And Isaiah said there shall be, that means future tense from his time period. The Great Pyramid was in existence for almost 2,000 years before he wrote that. I'm going to be rounding off the dates here, so to the nearest century, all right? I'm not trying in this episode to bring out who the Pharaoh was or the time period important, but I'm focusing on the Red Sea crossing, where it took place. And I have many quotes, so I won't be giving them all here. They're in my book. My book's free. It is on Amazon, but I'll show you my site. You can go to it and read it for free. And it has all the quotes and a lot more pictures and things. There's also maps that we're looking at today. Did they leave from the east delta? There's some 9 different crossing places of the Red Sea, 20 if you count the variations. About 90% of those who believe in the Exodus will pick one of these 5 routes. And they only have one thing in common, really. Obviously, if you have a different crossing place, the encampments before and after are forced to be in different places. And they're all leaving from the East Nile Delta. That's the problem. It's where they left from. And if you start in the wrong place, you're going to end up in the wrong place. But could it be that the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid watched the Red Sea crossing? Could it be that the most idolatrous town in all of Egypt in the days of Moses was right across from the Sphinx? Could it be that God saved the greatest miracle of the Old Testament, the Red Sea crossing, for the place that the Egyptians prided themselves in the most? Where was the border of Egypt in the days of Moses? If we look on a modern day map and say, here's Israel, that's where it's at today. At one time, Israel, for example, the northern border went all the way up to the Euphrates River. The Red Sea, Egypt itself, and the countries surrounding it did not have the modern day map 3,500 years ago. Like I say, I'm rounding off the dates here. And so we have to look to the Bible. We have to look to people who wrote during the 1st century and a few centuries before to find out where they're placing these boundary lines. You did not have to go all the way to a modern day map boundary line to leave Egypt. In fact, the classical writers, the people, the Greeks and the Romans who wrote a few hundred years before and after the Apostle Paul, they have Egypt being the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley is only 10 miles wide at its widest point, and also the Delta. Libya, they said, was on the west. Arabia, you didn't have to go to Saudi Arabia to get to Arabia in the days of Moses. You just went out of the Nile Valley. That whole area to the east was Arabia. The Egyptians did not live out there on the desert except to do their mining or their rock quarries. That's a desert area, things that very hard to get things to grow there. Herodotus, who wrote in 440 BC, He said Egypt is the gift of the Nile. He meant that they were living on the silt that came down from the Nile River. It flooded every year, and that valley was rich. Things grew there. The Egyptians were there. They were in the delta. They were in the Nile Valley. That desert was for Bedouins. If I was to show you a picture, and there are some pictures of Jesus with blonde hair and blue eyes, you would probably say, Gary, haven't you read the Bible? Jesus was a Jew by his mother. She was a Jewish maiden. That's correct. But there are people who believe that's Jesus, okay? Because they've seen it and maybe it's hanging on their wall. I mean, no disrespect to anybody. But if we're going to be looking at an Anglo-Saxon Jesus, then it would be okay to look at a modern map. Modern maps are not the boundary lines of what's taking place in the Bible. The Bible does not say they left from the east side of the delta, but most of the people have them doing just that. Well, why? I give plenty of reasons why it simply wasn't possible in my book. There are some people who are saying, reputable people, that after 3,500 years we're never going to find these names that are given in the Bible for the encampments of Israel. Well, actually they're right if we keep looking in the same places. But we're going to have to think outside the box here. Place names are hard because, you know, we're dealing with different languages and interpretation and translations of this nature. The Red Sea, the Reed Sea, it's very common in the Bible for a place to have more than one name. The Sea of Galilee has 4 names in the Bible. So you can't have more than 2 names. And names change. And there's reasons why are they given. The Greek New Testament, where it says Red Sea in the Greek, it's Red Sea. In the English, they translate it Red Sea. In the Hebrew Testament, Old Testament, it has a Red Sea, but that's translated from the Hebrew, which is Sea of Reeds. And some people have gone off and say, well, it must have been shallow water because it was a sea of reeds. That's like saying the Red Sea must be red. You know, it's blue like any other body of water. Names are given for different reasons. It was a sea, and it had reeds in it. And it will become obvious why the Jews called it the Sea of Reeds here. We know from Scripture it was deep water. There's 10 verses I give in my book that say it was deep water. This particular verse here says it was the waters of the great deep. For the names here, I'm going to be leaning upon Strong's Concordance. It's online, it's free, anybody can access it. Now here we have the flooded delta. This is an annual event every year for about 5 months. It took several weeks to get up to the maximum height and come back down again. This is actually, this picture here looking across from the far side, 6 miles across. This is taken over 100 years ago. I have permission to use this photo. That is where modern day Cairo would be today, that flooded area. If it wasn't for the Aswan Dam, much of Cairo would be underwater. That area and the delta, the Egyptians referred to it as the land of papyrus. And when it was flooded, they called it the lake of papyrus. That would be translated by the Jews, Sea of Reeds. Papyrus being reeds, the Yam Suf. The Yam is sea. For the Hebrew Bible, they use the word sea. It does not have to be salt water. The Sea of Galilee, for example, it is fresh waters. Now I have some Bible verses here. It talks about when Israel left Egypt, they left in one day. The very day they left Egypt. They didn't have to go hundreds of miles out or dozens of miles out. They went out the very same day. How is that possible? Well, they weren't going by the modern day map. What they were doing was going up on the ridges. Again, the classical writers not only have Libya on the desert there all the way up to the border of ancient Egypt, which was the Nile Valley, but that ridge right there. The pyramid, for example, a great pyramid up there in the Giza Plateau outside of Cairo, that sits up about 100 feet approximately above the plain there. That plain used to flood. And that ridge there goes up in some places in the Nile Valley up to 800 feet. It's the same on both sides. Now it expands out when it comes to the delta and gives room for the delta. So my point being that when they left, they did not have to go way out in the desert. They left immediately. And yes, they left Egypt. Now most people believe the Goshen was on the right side. Jewish writers, Josephus, Artapanus, Josephus, 1st century Jewish historian, Artapanus wrote in the 2nd and 3rd, or maybe 3rd century BC, before Christ. And they have the Goshen being more than just the east side. They have it up at Heliopolis. These are the Greek names that were given when the Greek dynasty ruled Egypt. And Sais. Sais is on the west side. And this is what the ancient Jewish writers are saying. The Bible says that Goshen was the best of the land of Egypt. I have no problem believing that all the delta was the best of the land of Egypt. We have our Josephus saying they left from the west side. He says they left from a place called Lithopolis, again another Greek name, and I'll read here. He says, so the Hebrews went out of Egypt. Now they took their journey by Lithopolis, a place at that time deserted, but where Babylon was built afterwards when Cambyses laid waste Egypt. Now this strange name, Babylon, I'm not talking about over by the Euphrates River. He's talking about there was a fort called Babylon. It was built about 500 years before the time of Christ. And he says at a place where Fort Babylon would later be built. And that's directly across from the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx and the Great Pyramid are only about 1/3 of a mile apart here. And Lithopolis was a district or a nome of Egypt. It was only on the west side. He wasn't calling Fort Babylon by this name. There's no history it was ever called Lithopolis. About 2 centuries ago, an archaeologist just uncovered the Sphinx, and its paws had been covered in sand. And on one of the paws of the Sphinx, it says, the guardian of Litho, without the polis on the end. And so this was in the nome of that second nome, both the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. Now, at the Sphinx, between the paws of the Sphinx, is a stele called the Dream Stele. It's by a pharaoh who would later, a man who would later become pharaoh, and he's offering up, giving offerings to the Sphinx. It was an idol. It wasn't some monument like we might think of. He prayed to that stone idol, and later he became pharaoh. And he mentions on this the great statue of Harmaches. That was another name that the Egyptians had for the Sphinx. They also called it Horus in the horizon. Again, the name Sphinx and Pyramid are Greek names, not the Egyptian names. The great statue of Harmaches, close to Kher-aha. Now that is directly opposite the Sphinx, this town of Kher-aha. It was 6 miles across. It was a very idolatrous town, and at one time there it would have been the apex of the delta. It's moved farther south. The Nile continually put silt in there with the annual floods until they built the Aswan Dam. And in this stele, the dream stele of the Sphinx, it is interesting that they don't even mention the Nile River between the Great Sphinx and Kher-aha, just like Josephus doesn't mention it when he talks about where Israel left Egypt. They crossed one time the major sea here, not multiple seas. Josephus also said that they set them, Israel, also to build pyramids. Now, very few people believe what Josephus said. They don't believe the Israelites built the pyramids. They don't believe they were built by slaves. Now, he doesn't say they built all of them. He doesn't say they built the Great Pyramid. I'm just quoting what he does say, that at some time while they were slaves, they built pyramids. All the pyramids, there's about approximately 100 pyramids, they're all on the west side of the Nile. There's no pyramids on the east side. In the Egyptian mind, the sun set there, that's where the sun died, and then it rose again on the east. And so the main burial places, by far the biggest cemeteries of ancient Egypt were on the west side, because that was the house of the dead. And so we have the pyramids there, which means that in order for them to build pyramids, and they were building pyramids up to the beginning of the 18th dynasty, in order for them to build pyramids, then they would have had to have been on the west side. Now, the capital of Egypt, according to the Jewish writers during the time of the Exodus, was Memphis. Memphis was the longest lasting capital of Egypt. At different dynasties, sometimes they would move the capital to another city, but Memphis was the largest city in all of Egypt. Both Philo and Artapanus have it being there during the time of the Exodus, and Artapanus, who wrote 2nd century BC, said that the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh took place at Memphis. Again, Memphis is on the west side of the Nile River. Now in Numbers 33 and verse 7, we have this command where it says, turn again. God wants them to go back where they started from. He wants to trick Pharaoh into following them, to make Pharaoh think that they're entangled in the land. So Israel does this big circle from Ramses, it goes down to Succoth, then it goes to Etham, and then it's going to go back to where they were. They're not going to a city. Outskirts by a city, I have no problem with that. They're just too large to be in any city. And we already know they've been at Etham, they've been at Succoth. So Pi-hahiroth, the Kher-aha, according to the Genesis lexicon, is Egyptian. The Pi-hahiroth is Hebrew. It means mouth of, probably because the apex of the delta used to be there, and I give lots of evidence for that in my book. It's filled in, you know, the Nile River brought the silt down and moved the apex farther down, but it's still flooded up there right by the Great Pyramid whenever the annual flood was there. But this turn again is very important. The Numbers passage says they turned, but the word turn in Numbers chapter 12 and Numbers 33 where it says turned again is the exact same Hebrew word. Now they've made dozens of turns in 40 years. But nowhere in Numbers 33 does it talk about this except one place, and then it says they turned again. So this is not just a normal slight turn. They're going back to where they started. Listen to what the Jews themselves say about this. Really amazing. From the Legends of the Jews, it says, quote, Moses gave the signal to turn back to Pi-hahiroth. Those of little faith among the Israelites tore their hair and their garments in desperation, though Moses assured them that by the word of God they were free men and no longer slaves to Pharaoh. They say, hey, we don't want to go back there. We've been slaves. We don't want it no more. Moses said, don't worry. God's going to protect you. It's going to be all right. You're free men. You're not going to be made slaves again. They understood what this turning again meant. And accordingly, it says, accordingly, they retraced their steps to Pi-hahiroth, where the great sanctuary of Baal-zephon is situated. When Josephus said that when the third day he makes a comment, they came to a place named Baal-zephon. That place has the temple. Right in front of the Sphinx is the great mortuary temple, and then the Sphinx itself. And that's where they came. These places had to be large. Migdal had to be large. Baal, which the Jews say was an idol, had to be large. It couldn't be some carry-around idol. They're used as landmarks for the entire nation. Now, before the Aswan Dam, we had this annual flood. 24 feet above the Nile was the average height. The Nile was a kilometer across and plenty deep enough to drown someone if they tried to wade across, and then another 24 feet on top of that. Definitely was deep water. And when you have these passages in Numbers 33 where it gives all the different encampments of the nation of Israel, when they come to the Red Sea crossing, God did something very unique. The other encampments, one day's journey, and one name place is given, then another journey, another place name is given. But when they come to the Red Sea crossing, he gives 4. It's like God saying, please guys, get this one right, okay? Now, what do you think? Is God going to work the greatest miracle out there in the desert? Or is he going to take the superpower of the world, the richest country in the world, the one with the greatest landmarks in the world, Egypt, during the days of Moses, and crush them with the greatest miracle of the Old Testament? Now again, before dams were built, like the Aswan Dam, the whole area flooded there. This guy's taking his boat, probably going across his own field, another 20 to 30 feet below him. And if he's over the Nile, it'll be a whole lot more than that. When baby Moses was put in the ark by Miriam and placed there in the Nile River, look what it says here. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maids to fetch it. That word flags is the exact same word that's translated red in the Old Testament. Not in every passage, but only when it talks about the Red Sea. The Yam Suf, that's the word Suf. Yam meaning in the Hebrew the sea. Again, the Sea of Galilee. It could be fresh water. But that's important. It ties this in with the Nile River. the Jews themselves, their ancient writers, plainly say the Nile River was the Yam Suf. It was the Red Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, 2nd century, maybe 1st century BC, says, quote, I proceeded by the Red Sea until I reached the extension of the Reed Sea, which goes out from the Red Sea. He's saying they were connected. And there is some archaeological reasons why they were connected. I give those in my book. And then I turned southward until I reached the Gihon River. He's saying in his day the Red Sea and the Nile were connected. They're interesting that the extension is called the Reed Sea. They believe they were one in the same place or just an extenuation of one or the other. They camped in front of, and we'll see later, they go into the sea before Pi-hahiroth, so the sea has to be between them and Pi-hahiroth. Pi-hahiroth is Hebrew, it means the mouth of, probably because that was where the apex was. There's also a huge canal that was there at Old Cairo at one time. Strong's gives the pronunciation of that last part, H-I-R-O-T-H, as a K sound, as almost everyone does. Genesis lexicon says that the last part, Hirioth, is doubtless to be regarded as Egyptian. It says it's doubtless, it's Egyptian. And this name, very similar to Cairo. By the way, where did Cairo get its name? They got its name from the Arabic name, and which I believe got the name from the town of Kher-aha. Where was Kher-aha? It was built on the location of ancient Fort Babylon. Before Fort Babylon, it existed in the days of Moses. There's no disputing of that part. The Egyptians called this site Kher-aha. It has different spellings, but always with the K on the front. And in the Bible, I believe it's the mouth of Kher-aha. It is interesting now, these Jewish legends, what they say about the directions on the points of the compass when it comes to Migdol and when it comes to the idol of Baal. It says, quote, Pharaoh is behind my flock Israel. In the south is Baal-zephon, in the north is Migdol, and before us is the sea lies spread out. So they have them in back of them, and they have it, one's in the north, the Great Pyramid is, and the Sphinx in relationship to Israel would have been in the south. Now the name Migdol is found 7 times in the Bible. 3 times it's translated tower, and other times it's just left Migdol. It is never translated fort, as some people believe. The ancient name that the pyramid was called by the Egyptians, Mir, M-I-R. They may have had some other names for it. It was Pliny, the elder, a Roman author of the 1st century A.D., he says, and I quote, the Libyan side, which was the west side, are the towers known as pyramids. Now, Baal-zephon, the Jews say it was an idol, and the name, they're familiar with it. I mean, it was Baal, and you can see Baal worship all through the Old Testament, and they were familiar with this god from their time when they were in Canaan. And when they come to Egypt, they'll use something they're familiar with to identify one of these gods, just like the Greeks and just like the Romans, who both had dynasties there in Egypt, and they would call the Egyptian god Atum, they called them Zeus and Jupiter. They just assimilated these gods into their own pantheon and gave them the names that they were familiar with, just like the Jews, calling the Sphinx, which was a Greek name, and they wouldn't use that name, which was hundreds of years after the fact. They used the name Baal. Now the question comes, what does Zephon mean? That name means north. It is given over 116 times, I think it is, in the Bible. Never is it translated terror or destruction. It is always translated north. There's sometimes when it's north side, north wind, but always north. Lord of the North. That's what Baal-zephon means. It's only found 3 times in the Bible, and all 3 times it's at the Red Sea crossing. Again, it has to be a major idol. It's used as a landmark for a nation. Now, the Jews have a very interesting tradition. It comes from Legends of the Jews. I want you to hear this. It helps identify the Sphinx as being Baal-zephon. Quote, of set purposes, God had left Baal-zephon uninjured alone of all the Egyptian gods. He wanted the Egyptian people to think that this idol was possessed of exceeding might, which it exercised to prevent the Israelites from journeying on. Now remember, God had knocked the night of the Passover, he had destroyed the idols of Egypt. I guess maybe they knocked them off their idols and they set them up later, or maybe just destroyed them completely. But their legends say there was one he didn't touch. And he was doing this whole thing of going back again, turning again to Pi-hahiroth in order to, bring and trap the Egyptians, have them follow Israel there. And he leaves this idol there. So if that's true, then there's no other possibility but the Sphinx. Everyone admits the Sphinx existed before Moses. And it was and is still there. And they're saying God left one untouched. There's no other possibility. Now take a look at the Sphinx for a moment. I believe the longest idol in the world, like 240 feet long. You notice it's got some disfigurement, the nose is missing, and people will debate how that happened. The false beard is broken off. That false beard is in the British Museum. But there's something else missing from the Sphinx. Something else has been knocked off. Not just its nose, not just its false beard. But there's something else missing, and it's in the British Museum. Take a look here at Pharaoh of Egypt, King Tut as he's known. On his head he has two emblems. Take a little closer look. On the left is the vulture, on the right is the cobra. The vulture was a symbol of the south. The cobra was a symbol of the north. Not every king ruled all of Egypt, but during his dynasty they ruled both Upper and Lower Egypt. He was the king of the two lands, northern and southern Egypt. This is one of the ways they could show this. Well, on the forehead of the Sphinx, there's no vulture. The headpiece with the mouth and the eyes of the snake, the serpent, the cobra, is in the Museum of the British Museum. But what's left of it, that's the outline, plainly seen, carved right into the forehead of the Sphinx of the cobra. This was the idol of the north. It did not rule both lands. So it was ruling the north, idol of the north, Baal-zephon. Now, is all this just a coincidence? I said there's a Bible passage which says Israel crossed the sea, being the flooded Nile, being the delta area, and it was from the west side. Well, let's take a look. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 15 and 16. All of Isaiah chapter 11 is prophetic when it was written. There's only two things that have happened since it's been written. One was references to the coming of Christ, and the other was in the future he was going to rescue his people again from Egypt. But how was he going to do this? Quote, "And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea." That word tongue there is translated bay in 2 or 3 other places in the Bible. He's going to utterly destroy the bay of the Egyptian sea, and with his mighty wind, like he did during the Exodus, shall he shake his hand over the river. There's only one river in Egypt, that's the Nile River, and shall smite it in the 7 streams. It is not debated, it is well known. I give different quotes of people. At one time the Nile, and when it branches off, had 7 different smaller rivers going down through the delta. 5 of them have silted up right now. Herodotus in 440 BC writes about it, and Diodorus in the 1st century BC, and Strabo in the 1st century also write about the 7 branches of the Nile. No one's debating this, and this has got to be here in Egypt. You would be surprised some of the interpretations I've read on this. And he shall continue, and he shall smite it in the 7 streams. This is the Nile. This is the part of the Nile that goes into the delta even, and make men go over dry shod like he did during the Exodus. And there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as. That means it's the same thing. Like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. This reference to the Exodus is significant. God's saying, in the future, I'm going to redeem my people again. I'm going to use my mighty wind. I'm going to smite it in the river. There's going to be the 7 branches. It's just Egypt. It says the Egyptian, it even says in the Egyptian sea. The Lord shall smite the tongue of the Egyptian sea. Look, the Egyptian sea is not over there in the Euphrates River, okay? They'll say, well, if it doesn't say Nile River, Nile River never says Nile River in the Hebrew. Now, Israel left about 2 months before the annual flood. So how are you going to have a flood when it's at the wrong time of year? The seventh plague was hail and fire mixed together. The seventh plague was more than that, though. It was rain. In fact, the Bible says it had poured rain. Look at these passages. Hail, very grievous, such as was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Now, all the land of Egypt, even in Bible's days of Moses, was all the way down to the first cataract, 600 miles south there of Cairo. And then it goes on and it says, Exodus 9, 33 and 34, and Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and spread abroad his hands unto the Lord, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and the rain was not poured upon the earth. It was before, but they stopped that. They stopped the hail. And when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder were ceased, so it rained. It's only got one place for rainwater, flood water, the greatest storm that had ever happened in all of Egypt. That's the Nile. And it's going to go down to the delta, and it's going to flood like it does every year. It's possible it could have even been more. It was a tremendous storm that had happened. Now, when did this happen, the seventh plague? There's some people that want to take all 10 plagues and give one plague for 1 month, and then the next plague would have happened on the second month, and they drag this thing all out. This is known as the Plague of the Month Club. But Usher's chronology has this happening 10 days before they left Egypt, the seventh plague, which would have fit perfectly. It takes 10 days just for the Nile to flow from, but where the first cataract is, which was Egypt, it took 10 days to get down to Cairo. And then when that's done, then it has to, all the flood waters of the Nile Valley also have to recede. It would have lasted probably 2 or 3 weeks. I want to talk about something that's in Bible apologetics when it deals with the Exodus and the 10 plagues of Moses. I'm not going to get into all the similarities between the admonitions of Ippur. There are amazing similarities. The date of this is, hotly contested. There's not a consensus on it. Some of it have it before what they believe would have been the time of the Exodus. Some of it have it happening way after. But it's amazingly similar to what happened during the time of Moses. Throughout all the land, it said, the waters turned to blood, there was plagues, there was also the hail, and everybody is, they're out there burying people because a lot of people are dead. That's just barely touching on the highlights. My reason for even mentioning it is because no one seems to bother with the Nile River. It's mentioned 3 times. It's mentioned 3 times that it's flooding, and all 3 times it doesn't seem possible to be the normal flood. It seems to be a flood that's at the wrong time. One of the things it says, quote, the Nile overflows, yet none plow for it. Well, they plowed for the Nile when it overflowed the time before that. They had crops there. Why aren't they going to do any plowing for this one? Maybe it's the wrong time of the year. The children who are witnesses of the surging of the flood is the second one I have here in chapter 11 of this admonitions. Well, what do you need witnesses for an annual flood? And what is it surging for? The annual flood did not surge. It took several weeks to get up. There was a gradual rise. And this last one here in chapter 13 of the admonitions, when men send a servant for humble folk, it goes on, it says, he sees the flood, the road is washed out, and he stands worried. So he's gone on this errand, and he has to stop. Oh, this road's been washed out. Look, if this is the annual flood, he's going to know that. What's he doing going on an errand to a road that he knows is underwater every year? He knows when the annual flood is. Everyone in Egypt knew that. And he could see it rising day by day. It takes several weeks. It's not going to catch him unaware unless it's an unexpected flood. Now, I told you I was going to give you an account, a legend, The Egyptian legend, this was found in papyrus, is found in many, many times. There are different variations of this. They sometimes talk about their gods being under the sea, under the water, under the Nile, under the flood, and there's some differences on some of them, but it's a well-known Egyptian, the contendings of Horus and Seth. Now, Horus was the good god of Egypt. All the Egyptian pharaohs had a Horus name, and Seth was the bad god of Egypt. He originally was one of their good gods, but he became demonized during the time of the Hyksos, which left Egypt. And the contendings of Horus and Seth. Now, they had a lot of contendings, but in this one, Seth wins. The bad god wins. This is really unusual. Quote, thereupon Seth said to Horus, come, let us both transform ourselves into hippopotamuses and submerge in the deep waters in the midst of the sea. Now as for the one who will emerge within the span of 3 whole months, the office shall not be awarded him. Then they both submerged, and so Isis sat down and wept, saying, Seth has killed Horus, my son. Then she fetched a skein of yarn, and she fashioned a line, fished a Devon weight's worth of copper, and cast it into the form of a harpoon. But then the copper barb bit into the person of her son Horus. So Horus let out a loud shriek, saying, help me, my mother Isis, my mother. Then she again hurled it back into the waters, and it bit into the person of Seth. So Seth let out a loud shriek, saying, what have I done against you, my sister Isis? Then she felt exceedingly compassionate toward him, saying, let him go. Then the copper barb let go of him. Horus, son of Isis, became furious at his mother Isis, and went out with his face as fierce as an upper Egyptian panther. Having his cleaver of 16 debit weight in his hand, he removed the head of his mother Isis. Well, isn't that interesting? There's actually some people who try to say this is teaching a high moral. Can you imagine that? I'm glad I'm not the one who has to explain why the good God's taking his mama's head off. At any rate, they're both underwater. There's many fights between Horus and Seth in their mythology and their legends. This is the only time Horus gets underwater. Seth does it other times. He's the god of storms. Horus loses. That's not supposed to happen. They were originally going to stay down 3 full months, but they both come up early because Isis, the mother of Horus, throws it in, and by mistake she hits her son. So he came up first. He lost according to the rules. He's mad about this. He takes off mama's head. Seth gets away. In their mythology, Seth represents the god of the foreigners. Now, I got a question for you. If this means what most people say that this means, it's referring to the struggles that Egypt had with foreigners, with other countries, then where in the whole world, in all of history, did any other country meet with the Egyptians under the water? Please, it's got to be the Exodus. It can't be anything else. And Horus lost big time. Now, what's even more interesting to me is where this takes place. It takes place right in front of the Sphinx in the Great Pyramid. According to Egyptologist Wallace Budge, he says, quote, according to the legend given in the 4th Salier papyrus, the fight between Horus and Seth was fought in or near the Hall of the Lords of Kher-aha. And he is referring to this particular battle they had. He says, Horus became enraged with his mother and attacked her like a leopard of the south and cut off the head of Isis. So, this happened right there where I'm saying the Red Sea happened. The Red Sea crossing in front of Migdol, the tower, in front of the Lord of the North, Baal-zephon, and right there in front of Pi-hahiroth, which means mouth up, probably the apex. They also had a huge canal there at one time by Old Cairo. Pi-hahiroth. That's where this took place. The Egyptians themselves record this. Hey, what's Horus doing losing anyway? And Seth, he gets away. Now, why has all this been passed over? Well, I'll tell you why. Because everybody's still looking on the East Nile Delta. Targum, Jonathan, and the Talmud say that Israel found something on the bottom of the seafloor you would not expect. When I first read this, I thought, oh, this is too off the wall. But then I realized, hey, there's a reason why they would have found this. Listen and see if you can figure this out. This is from the Talmud and Targum Jonathan. Quote, Israel walked upon the land in the midst of the sea, and there did spring up sweet fountains. Well, I could see fountains springing up, I guess, in the delta area there, and trees yielding food, and videroi and ripe fruit. What is vegetables and ripe fruit doing? And it says, even on the ground of the sea. What are we finding vegetables and fruit and trees that bear fruit on the ground of the sea at the Red Sea crossing? They left 2 months before the crops were brought in. And when you do that, you're going to find these at the bottom of the sea. Now, this is a freshwater sea here, just like the Sea of Galilee is freshwater. And you know, you can't, this doesn't fit in any other route. That's why this is probably the first time you've even heard this, because no one mentions it. It only fits here. Now, my book has all kinds of quotes and lots of good pictures. It's free. You'll have to go to the site. It's called True Christian Short Stories by Matheny, M-A-T-H-E-N-Y. Anyhow, if you just put True Christian Short Stories, it should come up on the first page. I give the web number there. And when you get to my site, take the pointer and place it over free books, and then the drop down will have the quest for the Red Sea crossing.